All right, our next set of notes is titled The Abolitionist Debate, and this lecture is going to look into the start of the abolitionist movement, how it is perceived in the North as well as in the South. And we're also going to see in this lecture the division between the states' rights and the federal government's rights as far as legislature and how much power they have in deciding which territories and which states are going to be free or slave states. All right, so getting into some light review about how abolitionism got its start. So we know that abolition originated as a religious issue. We had Northern Protestants who were led by the Quakers, as shown in this picture on the side. The Quakers are going to attack slavery on a moral principle. So they're going to say that all people are equal before God. And so having slaves work under whites isn't really representative of equality. However, we have other Americans who are going to go down a different route in saying that slavery is inconsistent with American revolutionary ideology. So again, slavery is inconsistent with liberty, equality, with democratic participation, and that in a democracy we have all people who should be able to participate in their government. However, with slavery, that's not a possibility. And so, again, inconsistent with American revolutionary ideology. We'll also see that slavery is going to be incompatible with free enterprise, and this is the idea that private businesses should be able to operate and compete with each other without state interference or without government interference. And so with slavery, we have a lot of government involvement, especially when it's going to come down to deciding which states are going to be free or slave states. So again, just a little more review, looking at how did the North stop slavery expansion. We know that this was a gradual process and not an immediate one. We have most northern states who are going to abolish slavery right after independence. However, it takes a couple decades to get everybody on board. So looking here at specific dates, in 1787, we have the Northwest Ordinance that's going to keep slavery out of Northwest Territory. So again, as we start moving west, people can go west, however, they can't take their slaves with them. And so our next date in 1808, Congress is going to declare the African slave trade illegal. So slaves can no longer be brought from Africa to America. However, the slaves that are already here, they're going to stay here, they're going to remain in the South and remain a really important part of the Southern economy. And so our last date, by 1820, we do see that slavery is abolished in most northern states, but it is going to take a couple decades to get these last few states on our side. But we've got the majority of our North in the blue. They get rid of slavery right after we declare independence. So looking into, was the North more innocent than the South? Because we don't want to paint a picture of the North being this really pure and innocent place while the South is evil, because in reality, the North was just as racist as the South. And so when we look into the North abolishing slavery, we can look into there just being fewer slaves in the North to give their freedom, or to give freedom to, because when it comes to slavery, the plantation agriculture really thrived in the South because the climate was better suited for the crops that they were growing. And so because of that, we did have slavery in the North, however, it wasn't as big of an institution. And so when we do free our slaves, it's going to be gradual, not immediate. Again, we have some stragglers in the process, and many Northern masters, they don't even really free the slaves, but they sell them to the South. And so the slaves, they're just relocating geographically, and they're just switching masters. So they're not free, most of them anyway, by any means. Another important thing is that most white Northerners are going to hold similar racial prejudices to white Southerners. Again, it's that racism ideology and that blacks are inferior to whites and that blacks need that paternalistic master to take care of them and to have a fulfilling life and to have a better life than they would have if their master was not there. So just racism all about in the North as well as in the South. And a really big example of this racism is that we have the American Colonization Society, who believed that if and when we did free our slaves, we should return them to Africa. And this is a problem because at this time, African Americans, they are American. They aren't associating or identifying with Africa, and so in sending them back to Africa, they would have just about as good a chance at surviving and knowing what to do as a white dude would. But you have this society who went as far as to purchase land. Modern Liberia was purchased by the American Colonization Society just to set up where we're going to send our slaves once we free them. So again, this is not going to work because African Americans, they are American, but you still have racial this racial imbalance and just racism all about. So the North is not innocent by any means. They're just as involved in this institution as the South. So looking into who are our abolitionists, of course, this is going to depend on different economic backgrounds, different social and cultural backgrounds, but when we generalize our abolitionists, most of them are going to be well-educated and wealthy leaders. So again, they just have more resources to get to that position of power in the abolition movement in spreading their influence and their anti-slavery rhetoric. Many of them are also going to be deeply religious. However, those who weren't religious did have scientific concerns as to why slavery was wrong and why slavery wouldn't work, and that slavery was an inefficient system, and that it wasn't going to be sustainable for the South to rely solely on slavery to feed their economy. We'll also see that women and free blacks are going to play a crucial role in the abolition movement. We have the woman in the middle here. She's one of the Grimke sisters. Her and her sister grew up with a father who owned slaves, and so they grew up to be really influential writers and orators, and they were spreading the word of abolition, became really important and really well-known leaders in the movement. And when it comes to free blacks, we of course have Frederick Douglass, who was an ex-slave, and so Frederick Douglass is able to take his past experiences and really showcase how slavery is wrong, why it is wrong, and again, just use his influence and his stories to spread the word about why we should abolish slavery. Another important thing that we'll see is that white abolitionists are often going to have a condescending attitude towards blacks. So again, that racism or that imbalance, that hostility that they'll have towards blacks in saying that, well, slavery is wrong, but I'm still not seeing eye to eye. I'm still not seeing how we're completely unionized after slavery is abolished. So looking into some actual leaders, some early abolitionist leaders of the 1830s, we have our first dude over here, William Lloyd Garrison. He believed that slavery was a crime and a sin. He was against colonization and compensation, so he was against sending ex-slaves back to Africa, and he was also against giving ex-masters money for their slaves or for freeing their slaves. He believed that they shouldn't be given any money just because their labor force is now free. He was not for that at all. What he was for was immediate abolition. So William Lloyd Garrison really wanted slavery to be over and be over now. Just get it done with because it's wrong. Another big leader we have is Theodore Dwight Weld, who is this guy up top. And Weld is a really effective leader of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he establishes a theological school for anti-slavery lectures so he can practice spreading his word, but also get other people some practice and also help them spread the word of anti-slavery as well. So looking into how did racism affect the abolition movement, we'll know that abolition is going to have limited appeal in the North where racism remains strong. So again, when you have this really strong racism of blacks are inferior to whites, talking about freeing slaves is not going to go on as well. And so we'll even see that many Northerners hated abolitionists just because abolitionists made up maybe 2% of the population. They were a really small group, and that you might have a large group of people who say that slavery is wrong, but they're not taking the actual steps forward to end slavery. So this would be somebody perhaps acknowledging today that climate change is a problem, however, they're not taking the actual steps to change the problem or to find a solution. And so the Northerners are going to feel that abolitionists and abolitionist leaders are really just troublemakers and that they're poking the bear of slavery. And so they want to just keep everything as it is. They recognize that it's wrong, but they can't really do anything to solve the problem. And so one thing that they're going to fear as a result is once we free slaves, now they're going to all spread into the Northern Territory, into the Northern states, and now we have job competitions between people who are already in the North and all of these ex-slaves. So they wanted their job security. They didn't want to have to compete with ex-slaves for jobs, and so that was a real fear that kind of pushed them away from supporting abolitionists. Another thing that they feared was that the South would take up arms with the Northerners, And again, you're pushing the bear. By talking of abolition, it's going to upset the South because they're relying on slavery to fuel their economy, and so that would just upset the South. They could take up arms, they could attack abolitionists as well as just Northerners in general. And so what Northerners would do, you would have some Northern mobs who would attack anti-slavery meetings or even abolitionist printing presses. And in 1837, we have Elijah Lovejoy, who becomes the first abolitionist martyr when he is murdered by a Northern mob. So looking into how much political power did abolitionists have, and really it's not much. The abolitionist leaders, they had a hard time getting support of the Whigs and the Democrats, the two major political parties at the time. And so what they decided to do is create a third party, and they called themselves the Liberty Party. However, there wasn't support of all abolitionists in the creation of this party. Many of them did prefer just to work with the existing parties, even though they did have a hard time getting support. They just wanted to stick it out because going third party didn't really seem as effective or didn't seem like it would get them any further than they already were. And we'll even see Garrison, our leading abolitionist leader, but a really extreme abolitionist leader, he doesn't want anything to do that is associated with slavery, and so he's even going to go as far as refusing to vote, just because in voting, you're voting under the US Constitution, which he considered to be a pro-slavery document. And so Garrison gets really extreme in that he publicly burns the US Constitution, and in this picture here, we see that right afterwards he is surrounded by Northerners and he's dragged off to be physically reprimanded for burning the Constitution. So really influential leader, but also really extreme in getting his point across. Looking into how is the South going to respond to abolition? So many Southerners are going to blame Northern abolitionists for causing trouble among slaves, and that any rebellions, any uprisings, the Nat Turner Rebellion, that's all going to be blamed on abolitionist leaders. Just in spreading the word of equality, it's causing problems with the slaves that it's just going to be all the abolitionists' fault. And so we'll see 1831 to 32 in Virginia, the state legislature is going to reject gradual emancipation and colonization. They are going to justify their slavery by saying we have a natural increase in our slave populations, so slaves are pairing up, having babies, and now we have an even larger population of slaves. And so to free all of these slaves and to send them to Africa, it's impractical. We just can't do it, so instead we're just going to hold on to our slaves. Another thing is that a lot of southern states are going to claim that slavery is a social necessity, and saying again that slaves are inferior and that really they're better off as slaves compared to factory workers. And that's what this picture really gets into. We have a picture over here of slaves who are being cared for, and that if they're sick or if they die, then their master cares because they just lost their labor force. Versus a worker in the North, if you die, then, well, we're just going to move on. So they try and use this to justify slavery and saying that slaves need us. Again, slave masters are this paternalistic figure because slaves are inferior mentally, emotionally, physically, which of course all ties back to racism. But they're also going to try and say that every class of people, every society is going to have a group of people who have to do the low-skilled menial jobs, the jobs that nobody wants to do. Somebody has to tough it out and do the jobs. And because African Americans are inferior mentally, physically, emotionally, they're going to be that group of people in the American society. Another thing that Southerners would try to do to justify slavery is they're going to use history, religion, anthropology, and even economics to defend slavery. So just a couple examples through history, we'll see that Southerners are going to say that even the ancient civilizations, going back to Mesopotamia, relied on slavery. They had slavery instilled within their culture. And so that's going to be used to justify slavery. When we look at religion, Southerners will say that it doesn't say anywhere in the Bible that slavery is wrong. Christ doesn't condemn it, therefore it must be okay. So they'll go to certain lengths to try and defend their peculiar institution. So continuing on with Southern reaction. By the 1830s, it's going to be really dangerous to express anti-slavery opinions in the South. And so here we have an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. We'll see that anti-slavery literature like this newspaper would be excluded and banned in some southern states. And in banning this literature, we're seeing that we have limitations on freedom of speech. And so the South is really going to some extreme lengths to try and stop the spread of abolition and to stop the talk of equality between blacks and whites. And even those who are suspected of having abolitionist sympathies, so not even an abolitionist, but you seem to be going down the path or even just hearing out this talk of equality, those people are going to be driven out after being tarred and feathered. So now we have limitation of speech, but also some physical repercussions of just hearing out talks of equality. And we'll see that Southern states are also even going to put a price on the head of leading abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, because again, he's really extreme in promoting equality, and so they're going to say, we want to get a hold of Garrison, dead or alive, so we can stop this talk of equality. So looking into why was westward expansion a problem? So as we continue moving out west and we develop new territories, these territories have to apply to join the Union. They had different requirements that they had to fulfill. And so with that, we see that we're going to need balance between free states and slave states, and that if one territory wants to enter as a slave state, the free states are going to get upset and saying, well, now we have this off balance because at the time, right before 1820 and the Missouri Compromise, we have 11 slave states and 11 free states. So any state who's going to come in is going to alter that balance and do a 12 to 11 ratio, which is going to upset either side. So as a result, we get the 1820 Missouri Compromise because Missouri wanted to enter as a slave state. But again, that would have set free states. And so what they do as a compromise and making both sides happy is they say, okay, Missouri, you can enter the Union as a slave state, and we'll just create a new state as a free state, and that's how we get Maine. So now we have Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state. They both enter the Union at the same time, and so we're keeping that balance, that even balance of now 12 free states and 12 slave states. So another thing that Congress is going to do to try and maintain this balance is we're going to have the 3630 latitude line, which is this line right here. And with this line, we are establishing that slavery will not exist above this line. Slavery can only exist below this line. So it's supposed to help in promoting and keeping this balance between free states and slave states. Looking into why was Texas a problem? So 1830s, at this time, Texas is still a part of Mexico. At the same time, Mexico says that they don't want any more American settlers coming into the territory. So no more Americans, but also no more slaves. And so Americans, they keep settling in the area, they keep bringing in slaves because the Mexican government was weak at the time, and so they have a hard time enforcing these laws. And so what Mexico tries to do is they try to send in an army to kick out the Americans, kick out the slaves, but they're defeated by the Americans, and in 1836, Texas becomes independent because after the defeat, Mexico is forced to recognize that Texas is now an independent territory. In 1844, President Polk, he decides that he wants to annex both Texas and Oregon, and so he promises America that he's going to have Texas enter the Union, but also have the entirety of Oregon enter the Union as well. However, with Texas entering the United States, this is going to anger Mexico because they still claim sovereignty over the land, and there's also some border disputes between where America ends and where America ends and where Mexico begins. And so with this and with the border dispute, we break out into war. This is the Mexican War. It ends in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and with this treaty, it ceded California, New Mexico, Utah, most of Arizona, parts of Colorado, and parts of Wyoming to the United States. And so because we're gaining so much territory, the United States does decide to pay Mexico $15 million to repair for damages in the war. So looking into why did the Wilmot Proviso cause further problems, in 1846, the Wilmot Proviso said that slavery could not expand into any new territories. And so this is going to get support of Northern Democrats because with this, they're not going to have any competition with slave planters. They're not going to have competition with plantation agriculture. However, this proviso did not pass. We see a year later in 1847, the Calhoun Doctrine is introduced, and this doctrine states that citizens have the right to take their property into any territory, and their property being slaves. So saying that me owning the slave, I should be able to take it wherever I go with me. And so with this, we start seeing talk of secession between the southern states, and they're going to say that the northern majority is continuing to rule over the rights of the southern minority. So it's saying that there's this power imbalance, and with this we have the South really talking of separating from the Union and from the United States. Looking into what was popular sovereignty. So with this, again, we have another compromise, and this compromise says that settlers and not Congress are going to decide the slave status for their territories. So in saying that we're going to have people come into the territory, it's going to be up to them, slave or free territory. And this is going to be consistent with democracy and self-government, and that the people are deciding for themselves which avenue they're going to take. However, some problems do arise, and that if Congress doesn't have the power to decide free or slave, when will a territory decide which route to take? And so we'll see the Northerners are going to say, well, we want you to decide right away because it puts pressure on saying that you're going to be a free territory. However, the southern states are going to say, no, no, take your time, because this allows them to think about slavery, to possibly introduce slavery later, which would then, of course, expand slavery. Looking into another compromise, the Compromise of 1850, this compromise addresses different things and different concerns for both the North and the South, northern and southern states. So the first main thing it's going to do, it's going to allow statehood for California. California enters the Union as a free state. It gives territorial status to Utah and New Mexico, allowing popular sovereignty. So again, Utah and New Mexico territories, it's going to be up to the people to decide whether or not they are going to be free or slave. There's the abolition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. There is a new Fugitive Slave Act that is going to make the South happy. There's resolution of the Texas-New Mexico border boundary, so setting up those borders of Texas and New Mexico, where one starts, where one ends. But we look at this and we can debate whether the 1850 Compromise was a settlement or a temporary truce, in that the North feared that Congress was giving in to Southern pressure and Southern threats. However, the North is really getting more out of this compromise compared to the South, and that California, a really large state, is entering as a free state. And even though Utah and New Mexico, it's going to be up to the people to decide free or slave, it is likely that they'll both enter the Union as free states. The only real setback that the North is getting is the new Fugitive Slave Act. So when we look into that, an important thing that the new Fugitive Slave Act is going to do is it's going to authorize federal marshals to organize posses and groups of people to find fugitive slaves on northern soil. And so any refusal to join or participate is going to result in a $1,000 fine. So saying that, come join us, if you don't, you're going to get fined. We're going to find runaway slaves, capture them, and then bring them right back to the South. And an important thing about this new Slave Act is that it targeted not only recent runaways, but also ex-slaves who had fled decades prior. And so it's taking no time into account. If you were once a slave, we're going to send you right back to the South. And that's where we'll stop.